This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, MICHAEL COVEL. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. For those of you paying attention, you know that on this podcast, I have expressed a slight tangent that I have gone off on over the last 18 months. Screenplays. 2 of them underway under my name. So it should come as no surprise that I'm interested in talking to people that really know something about the science of screenwriting. My guest today, Paul Gulino, does. A professor of screenwriting at Chapman University in California. This is Paul's second appearance. His second appearance in just a few months. Paul is the author of Screenwriting: The Sequence Approach, The Hidden Structure of Successful Screenplays. He is also the co-author of The Science of Screenwriting, The Neuroscience Behind Storytelling Strategies. Now, before you immediately say to yourself, Mike, I could care less about screenplays, I don't have any interest, I might ask you to pause that thought. Because what Paul brings to the table is an understanding of story, which is an understanding of communication. And if you can't communicate, you are nowhere, right? So that's why I quickly have a guy like Paul back on the show. I like to understand communication. I like to understand one of the great tools of communication, which is story. Without any further delay, let's jump right into my guest, Paul Gulino, and traverse the storytelling landscape. So, Paul, the news, I think the most interesting news to, at least for me, in the filmmaking world would be this little bit of a controversy that first started with Martin Scorsese going after the Marvel films. Then Coppola doubled down and defended Scorsese and went even further. I think he called them despicable. A third director, I forget his name, quite prominent, he came in and also went after the Marvel films. Is this just older guys, quite successful, who at one time were young bucks in the 70s, breaking all kinds of new ground? Is this just older guys in their 70s and 80s squawking about the new cinema of today, or do they have a point?
I would have to read in more detail what they're saying. It's hard for me to judge that. I know Scorsese's film the new one has just come out. It's kind of like pre-screened right now. That one's supposed to be an epic.
Their main point, and this can actually just open up to your view, perhaps, is we've got all these Marvel films that are generating billions of dollars, and there seems to be a formula, and they seem to be the same thing, and it seems to be very, very corporate.
Right.
Do you see that too, or is that just, hey, it's just another style of filmmaking and to each his own?
Well, let's see. It's certainly a style of filmmaking. I guess I can't say I'm an expert at it, but my guesses would be that this is highly successful internationally, that these are translating well overseas. You have a huge installed base of fans of the comic books already. Maybe it limits you in some ways, how creative you can get with these things. There are certain expectations with the audience. Yeah, they'll get the same people writing them. I mean, I guess you would say it's antithetical to the kind of independent personal vision filmmaking that you might see from Scorsese in his prime, or even now. Why someone would be tearing it down, that's an interesting question about the frustration of age. You're right, perhaps feeling like you're on the outside of the big trend.
I've not seen it yet, but for example, if Scorsese was upset about the Marvel portrayals and the kind of comic book nature and the very corporate rollout and all that kind of stuff, I would think that perhaps with the new Joker film with Joaquin Phoenix and De Niro, that perhaps because I know that was inspired by some of his work, that maybe he actually likes that one. And I'm not trying to get you to comment on Scorsese's point of view or anything. I'm just kind of opening this up to this, what seems to be a debate about big films, which I liked The Dark Knight. I liked those portrayals. I don't really care for the new superhero films today, the Marvel films. They don't really do much for me. They're kind of boring. I mean, they're still films, at least to me. I mean, an audience likes them, clearly.
Yes, it's almost, how could I say, I certainly avoid them. I've seen a few. I did a column on one of them. Maybe it's my phase in life that I'm not interested in the fantasy. I'm interested in more exploring. Well, first of all, I'm an outsider to the extent that I wasn't really a comic book reader as a kid. Yeah, when we get to, I guess I'm more interested in a personal vision myself, or a personal view about life, or human issues that are twisted and confusing and interesting. And The Dark Knight was an example of that in a comic book type setting. I don't know if you could say if you've seen one, you've seen them all, because I haven't seen them all. But certainly in my phase in life, age 61, it's not subject matter that's of interest to me. I can understand someone seeing it as a corporate product, not quite like Pop-Tarts, but new flavor of a new product, and not as much, nothing that really surprises. When I listen in on people talking about these who are fans of these kinds of movies, in some ways you're limited by the creativity, by the fact that you have inherited these characters that audiences want to recognize in a certain way, and there's a limit to what you can do with them. You have to deliver expectations to some extent. That may, as a consequence, be why you would see a lack of creativity and a lack of excitement around them by people outside of that little world.
I would guess their real fear, perhaps, is that, I mean, I don't think Scorsese has some personal animosity. I think what they're really driving at is that perhaps the big corporate cartoon comic products could squeeze out the kinds of products that you're saying that you like to see, that they want to make. Perhaps that's the real debate that's going on.
I thought about this, that I wonder if the feature film is on the way to being kind of a niche form. It was the mainstream for 100 years now, but it may be that with the rise of streaming, we're going to see fewer features, more series. In the theaters, we're going to see more of the comic books. To go back to the science of screenwriting, basically from a cognitive viewpoint, a series is more efficient than a feature, because when you watch a movie, you have to, in order to get the emotional payload that you're seeking, you do have to invest a certain amount of energy in it, which is the learning process. You have to learn, who are the characters? What are they about? What's the circumstances that the story will take place? That takes some learning. Okay, you got to expend some energy. But if the payoff is an emotional joyride, then that's okay. Now, in a feature, you might spend a half hour learning that stuff, and then the payoff is an hour and a half of a roller coaster ride, ideally. On a series, you may spend the first half hour learning who, what, when, where, under what conditions, and then that thing goes on for many episodes. It just becomes all payoff. When you have a delivery system like the streaming services, who can deliver series that have interesting characters and very involved stories, novelistic kind of stories, and that's competing with a one-off, basically a 2-hour piece where you just have to know the characters, and then once it's over, that's it. Then I wonder how the features will compete with that. I haven't looked at, I don't know the current box office figures, but it seems to me that the crowds aren't that big unless you're talking about these comic book in the theaters, unless you're talking about these comic book type shows. Your question perhaps about the future of what they love is not only just indie or individual or visionary kinds of work, but it may be just that the competition is now there for the adult audience above 25 is with interesting series that you're going to get on streaming and with characters that you're going to come back to every night.
That's an interesting point, and I'll have to share something with you that since our first conversation, I've become a Netflix subscriber.
Oh, okay.
I have also now, since our first conversation, I have binge watched the entire Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul prequel. Now, after all these years of hearing about it, I now know what it is. So when you start talking right now about how the series can pull you in with a couple interesting characters and how the streaming and how that works, yeah, no doubt. You kind of feel like you're watching a slightly underproduced film with Breaking Bad, but with movie star-like characters.
Movie star-like characters and tremendous skill in the storytelling. When I'm analyzing films for students, I try to find current films that I think can teach you lessons and how your options, your tools, your storytelling tools, and how you can use them on your own work. And I like to give examples from movies, analyzing them. And I try to stay up on more recent ones. But I find the real craftsmanship is in the older ones. And I wondered, where did that go? Well, look at Breaking Bad, and he's playing on so many levels with surprise and suspense and constantly topping himself. It's a writing team, but you see some real panache in the storytelling, just not in the effects. Like you said, it's not necessarily the budget of a feature, maybe the later ones, but you have this ability to take each episode and then each season and just keep twisting it in a little bit higher intensity, a little bit higher, explore it in another way until you really got to explore everything you can. Yeah, so I'm glad you got a chance to see that.
I'm going to unpack into some examples and some film examples, some character examples. But I love this phrase, and I use it in my world, reverse engineer. So when you sit down with students, you can pick the level of the class in your mind. But when you sit down with students and you want to pick a film, and if you've got several choices in your mind, you might want to pick one that maybe the audience that's listening to us right now can relate to. But when you sit down to work with students and reverse engineer a film to really unpack it for an assortment of reasons, what are some of the films that you like to really sit down that are the great teaching lessons for you?
For many years, I began my analysis class with Toy Story because it's a remarkable achievement, the original one. And it's not too long, and they know it, and they love it. But it's so rich with storytelling craft. They managed to get that right. I try to show a variety of strategies. This year, I did a movie called The Hate You Give, which just came out last year. It's got more of a passive main character, but it shows how do the storytellers deal with that. A film that I also showed this year in terms of you want to see how you can manipulate what the audience knows, what it doesn't know, what the characters know, what they don't know, and keep the story moving, is a 1988 picture called Midnight Run. The students seem to respond to that one. I just showed them that this semester. And that happens to be one that was made by a student of my mentor, Frank Danielle, when he was at the American Film Institute. So that's one. If action, comedy, interesting characters, it's kind of a guy movie. It's a buddy movie, but it's a textbook you could look at. A recent one, I did the movie In Bruges. I don't know how recent that is. It's 10 years old, I guess. But again, an alternative kind of storytelling with not the kind of character you would normally expect to relate to, a guy who murders a priest and kills a child, but yet we go with him, and how that works and how the filmmaker there was able to integrate and embroider the script with a lot of motifs, elements, work on it thematically, work on it in the filmmaking visually. Another contrast in terms of a movie that doesn't follow all the formulae, you could say, is One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. You have kind of a contra example. You have a character you wouldn't expect to like, but you do. You have these ironies where you have the doctor who's trying to cure people as the villain, and the villain is the one who's curing people. Along the way, it's a shattering experience.
One that I think people can really relate to, I know I can. You've obviously torn apart the original Star Wars.
Oh, right, in the book. Yeah, the original Star Wars was always my favorite one. It was just really nicely done. It was a miracle. It's a nicely contrived series of chases and escapes in a very fresh way at the time. And it does have this kind of embroidery of different elements that you see come back in different forms. Yeah, I'd ask students a question. I asked them, okay, a movie came out in 1977 that broke all the box office records. And they all know, yeah, it was Star Wars. And I say, well, what was it? It was a beautifully contrived series of chases and escapes. And then I say something else came out in 1980 that made 3 times as much. And they always guess wrong because it's a trick question. The answer is Pac-Man, the game Pac-Man. What is that? That's a series of chases and escapes. And people are drawn to that. We love that. Star Wars managed to do it really nicely.
I would like to keep you there for a second at Star Wars and just curious your perspective on this. I have noticed, and I see this across films, I see this across music, there's something about the original release, the original product, film, song, whatever, from the artist, the director, that is often very fresh. I can see that in the original Star Wars. I could see that in perhaps any artist almost, where it seems like sometimes their early music is the freshest and most authentic. Then we get further along in the Star Wars series. Okay, The Empire Strikes Back was really nice, but then everything else starts to feel overproduced and perhaps formulaic. I'm answering my own question here, but there is something to this that perhaps when that director, that artist is struggling to get that first baby out, there is so much energy and so much creative energy, insights in it. And then if it's super successful, the rest of Hollywood then gets involved to help push the thing along. Maybe it loses some of that enthusiasm that the original artist had in mind.
Well, it's certainly a different experience from, like you say, I mean, Lucas had success with American Graffiti, that lower budget picture, and actually Star Wars wasn't much of a budget either. I think the original, it was on a shoestring, but they pulled it off. But okay, the question of were they, I suppose as an artist, you don't know whether A, it's ever going to see the light of day, or B, whether this will be all you'll have. You just kind of do your wind up and throw everything into it. And then, as you say, once that's out there and it's successful, then the universe consists of, originally it was just you trying to create something. Now it's you, this thing you created, and now trying to create something else. I suppose Lucas might have had ideas for what was going to be the sequels to that. It's done in kind of a serial, begins with a classic Flash Gordon serial kind of opening. There may be, depending on the artist, different elements in play, such as the pressure that you then get under, what the expectations are, that this has to be somehow top the last one. Maybe a classic example is the Michael Cimino film, the Vietnam one. What was it?
Deer Hunter.
Deer Hunter, yes. I knew there was a hunter in it somewhere. Right, and this was such a surprise masterpiece. Then he follows it up with Heaven's Gate. The first time you're a struggling filmmaker, and the second time you're a genius, and you have to do something incredible.
Heaven's Gate, to remind people, is one of the biggest flops in the history of cinema, right?
Right. It was not only a big flop, but yes, it was a hugely expensive, extravagant. Apparently, they had parties celebrating when the day they shot more footage than Apocalypse Now. Back in those days, footage was expensive. The artist could certainly be affected by that. What's interesting, I think it does depend on the artist. You wind up with somebody like Billy Wilder, who had 2 decades of really good movies, but he was coming out of the studio system. And there was a whole system for making movies that perhaps kept artists, they were like guardrails to keep them from going off too far. So you do have artists that can turn in consistent work. Yeah, it's certainly a situation where the game-changing movie changes the relationship of the artist to the creative process. It's a much more trivial example, but I remember I had the script that I wrote for my thesis at Columbia. I was submitting it around afterward, and I managed to get a William Morris agent. Figured, wow, this is it. Finally, I'm going to start working as a writer. After a few weeks, he couldn't get anybody to buy it, so he said, okay, what you got next? And I didn't have anything ready. I said, oh, don't worry, I'll get something to you. And I had some ideas kicking around. And I just wound up having a real case of writer's block, because now there was pressure on me to follow up what had been a successful piece for me with something that was going to top it or equal it. The extra eyes didn't help, the pressure.
Let me keep you at that for a second, and let me, if I can guess a little bit there, and you can tell me about your life at the time. And I'm curious how writers handle this. I know from my experience, and this is primarily in books, and as I've told you in my last conversation, some screenplays that are slowly making their way now. I find in my experience that it's my experience that drives me. It's having something that's happened to me, an insight or a path that I've gone down. I feel like if I don't have those, I can see how writer's block can happen really quick, unless one is a writer that is going down the path of just, for example, Michael Lewis, who did The Big Short and Moneyball, and he just apparently is very good at diving into the research process to figure something out about what he's interested in. But I think finding those influences as a writer is terribly important to keep going, isn't it?
Yes, I can see the wisdom in what you're saying. I mean, the first script that I wrote, the one that got me started, was kind of a supernatural story. I'd been mentored by Frank Daniel, and he guided me in making it very personal. There were connections. It was not autobiographical in the end. It had autobiographical elements that were very important to me, and that must have shown through. When I did the follow-up, it was much more of a comedy that just a funny premise that occurred to me. It was, in effect, when you're doing something like you said that you've experienced or that you have knowledge of firsthand, it's like the road is already illuminated for you and you just ride down that road. If you don't do that, then you're pulling things out of the air, and maybe that's not as profitable or persuasive way to create. I know the first one that I wound up selling was based on a real story that I relied on the testimony of a person who went through it. So that kept it really grounded, and the person was a resource for detail. So that played a role there too.
Let me take you back to something as I jump you around the landscape here. Let me take you back to a series that we were talking about earlier. There was something I wanted to flesh out there, a path I wanted to go down, and to kind of really unpack, for example, why Breaking Bad pulls us in. Now, people have lots of debates about whether that's the best series or not. I don't know if it is, but I do know that when I watch it, you almost can't stop watching. The twists and turns that the writing team have put together are quite amazing, because you think you see it coming, but then you don't see it coming. That is what we as humans want. We're curious. This curiosity thing that we've got is the reason. I mean, the Breaking Bad team knows we're curious. They know we want to see clues and follow along. And so they've constructed this crazy meth making story in New Mexico. And that's how they use that to go after our curiosity.
The craftsmanship, in terms of studying it, I've looked at the first episode, again, analyzed that with my students, but the rest are remarkable too. It looks like the what if, the inspiration, the kind of what if moment is, what if a chemistry teacher gets into meth, creating meth to make money? Well, then you justify it with this cancer diagnosis and the need to provide for his family. You wind up with someone we can relate to who has a particular skill set and is able to apply it. Then we see the fish out of water kinds of developments. The fact is, most of us have relationships, people we love, people we work with, people we see every day. When they establish those, and then you see the disruption of those, that's a lot of mileage you can get as things fall apart, as relationships get frayed, and then, of course, it creates new ones. But the opening of Breaking Bad, how do you get people in? Well, there's this phrase that my mentor, Frank Daniel, used to use called the garlic in the coffee, two things that don't go together. You can use this concept to hook an audience. It's like things that don't go together and that make us curious, that play on that curiosity and that draw us in. And I'm constantly urging my students to think about what's going to grab us. How are you going to grab me? When you're writing your story, you're writing a web series, what are you going to do to grab me and then keep me? How do they begin Breaking Bad? You could start with the character in the normal flow of life, the ordinary world, some people call it, the in medias res, the Latin phrase for in the middle of things. Character is a school teacher, and they have a wife, and they have a kid who's disabled, and they have a job that they have to get two jobs to make ends meet. And that might be interesting, but it may not be. But how about if you, instead of starting there, you start out with a guy in the middle of the desert with no pants on, just a shirt, police sirens coming, he's recording a confession and getting ready to kill himself. Now, that's garlic in the coffee several times over. That's maybe threw in some tarragon in the coffee too. I don't know. But it's like, that's arresting. And that makes me curious. And that's craftsmanship. The guy knew how to do that. Then we work backwards. We've been promised something. We're going to get some explanation about this, but we just have to be a little patient and learn. And that's when he hooks us into the learning. Can you see a sequence? We talked last time about sequences. Sure, you can see the sequences. The first one is introducing the characters and setting up his world, introducing his brother-in-law who invites him to do a ride along, likes to brag about things. He also introduce us to money gets confiscated from these drug busts, and you get the cancer diagnosis. The second episode, he goes on the ride along and he connects with the guy to do the meth. And the third sequence it's 45 minutes, I think, total. The next sequence is they cook it and they run into some complications, and we wind up back where we were at the end of it, but it doesn't resolve. We have actually, I think there might be the beginning of a fourth sequence in there, and then they break it off and don't tell you the rest. And now you got to tune into the rest. Subunits that you would see in a feature are there. You have mini stories within the big one. The use of curiosity and then the use of various tension. The objective of the character is clear. He's got to do this to get the money to support his wife. And then we're left dangling at the end with what are called dangling causes, different elements that have been put in play that we're going to pick up later if we tune in. This is a product of what would seem to be someone who's really knows how to craft something. I saw it done. There's another episode that I forget. I think it might be the third or fourth. The use of multiple layers of irony, that they're out in the desert. I forget the circumstances. They are the ones that the bad guys want, but the bad guy doesn't know that they're the ones. The TV is playing and he has distraction. There's a lot of little twisted layers of problems that they get into that they manage to have satisfying escape routes for. That skill, especially the escape route, having them get in a tight situation and get out of it, that is a skill set that how to pull those off effectively is one of these examples of you have to write it backwards. And I see in a lot of movies, and I've seen a few of the comic book movies, and what makes them disappointing for me is that you have a character in a difficult situation. Now, how are they going to get out of it? And the answer is they just get out of it. They're just a little bit stronger. They're just a little bit faster, and it's boring.
It's so interesting with Breaking Bad when you talk about things that don't go together. And even as the series progresses, things that don't go together become more known, because when the series starts, he's not a meth cooker. As the series goes along, he's now a meth cooker with a brother-in-law who's a DEA agent. It's something that doesn't go together, that was not something that didn't go together at the start of the series, but as the series progresses, it's another twist of something not going together.
Right. It takes some skill to do that. And I'll give you an example of skill versus inspiration, because I can only teach skills. I can't teach people to be inspired. Okay, so what you just mentioned there, where you have a cop and a meth cooker, and the cop doesn't know that the meth cooker is a meth cooker, and the two have a relationship where they're bound together by family. And it generates all kinds of really cool scenes, makes you the use of dramatic irony. We saw that there's a 1940 picture called The Shop Around the Corner. And this is a movie about two salespeople in a shop, a man and a woman. Each of them is secretly corresponding anonymously with a lover by mail. They're in love with the person that they're corresponding with, although they've never met the person. And they don't realize that the two of them are corresponding with each other. That's the twist. The two of them hate each other in person. They don't get along in the shop. And each one is bragging about the one that they're in touch with by mail, who's really wonderful. We know what they don't, which is that the person they're corresponding with is the person they hate. To make that premise work, you need to have them together a lot, physically together, because every scene that they're together carries that double meaning. Two people who hate each other, who love each other. We have a chance to look at the craft of doing this kind of story in the remake in the 90s called You've Got Mail. You've Got Mail, one of the choices they made was to put the two lovers in separate companies. One owns a bookstore, the other owns a bookstore conglomerate, big corporate type. The two of them are instantly not physically together. They're corresponding with each other, and they don't like each other because they're rivals. In order to get them together, the writers have to expend energy and time on justifying why they come together. That's simply a choice that's ill-advised. If you know better, then you don't make that choice. Breaking Bad, is something that exploits exquisitely this kind of irony and the layers of irony and who knows what and who doesn't. It also there's a scene I like to show my students. I guess you could call it a sequence that I think it runs about 20 minutes. I showed them this sequence because it's an example of a really good, what would we call maybe a webisode. It just stands alone by itself, but it's in the second or third episode. And you'll remember this. The main character has to kill the dealer who survived. And the dealer who survived is in the basement locked up with a bicycle lock. Remember that?
So the pole around his neck, yeah.
Oh, right, by his neck. You have two characters, really one location, upstairs and downstairs. You could maybe it's two locations. Simple props. The main character literally says, "You got 30 minutes to explain to me. Tell me why I shouldn't kill you." So you have this remarkable tension going on. The procrastination and the dilemma the character's in. It's not as interesting if the character who's got the dilemma is a hitman or an action figure. But if he's a school teacher, then it is a big issue. You may recall that the guy gives it his best shot. He gains his confidence. He talks about how, I used to work for my dad. And you remember that store, and they recognize each other. And he's in the process of trying to connect as on a human level. Just when sounds like he's convinced him, you notice that detail about the shard that's missing. And the twist comes and the resolution comes. It's a gripping sequence.
You never know what's going to happen in that particular group of sequences and scene at the end until it happens. You keep guessing.
Right. And yet the escape route is planted there. It's not just that he happens to see the guy's holding a screwdriver. The shard has been planted in the context of this story because the plate shattered. When he pieces it together, it all makes sense because we saw him drop it. And we saw that he was blacked out for a while and he was unconscious. So there was an opportunity for this guy to do something. We piece it together and it makes sense. That's an example of someone who's worked it. They didn't stop with the first draft and throw it down. They've gone back and set things up.
There's another twist in Breaking Bad. There's so many twists, but I tell you, one of the ones that was most interesting, I don't think this is really a spoiler too much, and I don't know if you got that far into the series, but when we learn that the fast food restaurant owner is the largest meth distributor, you just don't really see that coming. You don't see that coming at all. I asked a friend of mine who was in law enforcement, I said, I enjoyed this series. I said, but so many of the plot twists in this damn show were just not believable. It was just too all over the map. I mean, the writers were obviously having a lot of fun. They were going down every twist and turn, but just not real life. And this law enforcement guy looked at me and said, you know what? You might need to rethink that.
That's a great compliment. That really is. That's what I'm trying to get my students to aspire to. And they're not by any means on that all at that level. That's a rarity. I've sampled other streaming things, and some are well-crafted, some aren't. What I'm excited about the whole streaming thing is that it's giving a lot of writers practice. That's what happened in the great period in Hollywood history. It was not only a studio system by which knowledge about the craft was transmitted from master to apprentice, but these guys had a lot of practice. They were writing movie after movie and trying things. With streaming, there's that opportunity again. It can be features. I'd be curious to see how that happens, whether that becomes, like I say, a kind of more of a niche form or something else. It's really the competition between the novel and the short story. That's what we have now. Feature films have always had more in common with a short story than with a novel. Novels are really hard to do justice to. They're just too big for one sitting.
One thing I have noticed on Netflix, though, is that It is a quite interesting proposition, and there's going to be a lot of competition coming from other places like Apple and Disney, etc. But for the Breaking Bads that are out there, there's probably 10 streaming series that I can literally only watch a few minutes. Everything is just subpar. You wonder, how does the audience get that Breaking Bad is so good, but then is that same audience willing to watch some of this other stuff that is almost amateur hour? It's an interesting contradiction right now.
Yeah, well, that's a good question about how to gauge that. I guess you could look on IMDb and see what the ratings are, but it's so different from box office. Netflix keeps a secret, I guess. It's a corporate secret how many hits they get for each episode. They know who's watching them, but their model doesn't require stuff that everybody's watching. They don't get more money because more people are watching something. They just hold out the hope that people will resubscribe because the stuff they're doing is good. What is exactly what people think? Do they think that something that you and I might find not very good is just as good as Breaking Bad? Hard to judge that. I did notice that I really enjoyed the first episode of a series called The Terror, which was on AMC. It was about I think it was based on a novel which was based on the history of these two British ships in the 1840s who went on an expedition to discover the Northwest Passage and were never heard from again. Presumably they got stuck in the ice and they never made it out. This was a speculative novel about what happened. That series, one of the ships was called The Terror, Terror. The series was named after that. And it was quite riveting. It was 10 episodes and it got you through to the end effortlessly. They did a follow-up of The Terror called the same thing, but this was set at a Japanese internment camp in World War II. I could get through about an episode and a half, and the subject matter wasn't interesting. The quality of the writing wasn't the same. I don't know whether the writer had it taken away or who knows what happened, but you could see it, what you were saying. You watch one thing and it's really remarkable, and then something else doesn't work quite as well.
Let me keep with that for a second, because there's so many aspects to a series or a film. We can talk about the scenes and the structure of the scenes and all that. I want to talk about dialogue with you in our remaining time. I want to talk about dialogue, and you've got a great video on YouTube where you talk about dialogue, brief video, and you talk about, and I want you to explain what you mean here. You talk about taking dialogue, reducing it to a verb. For example, any kind of film or series, you're looking for that dialogue to, and there's probably more things, but as you describe it, you want the dialogue to attack, or it's defending or deflecting or persuading or seducing. But that dialogue has got to be active. I think sometimes in our normal life, we don't necessarily go that way. Our normal life might just be question, answer. Even in our conversation right now, question, answer. I'm not attacking you. I'm not seducing you. I'm not trying to persuade you. But in a film or a series, that's what the human mind wants. We want that.
Right. It's very seductive if you can do it that way, if you can pull that off. Yeah, the concept, it has to do with the notion of subtext. What does that mean? Because you'll get people to say, well, this dialogue's too on the nose. Characters are saying they're too obvious. And so you need to put subtext in there. What most people think of as subtext is something like, well, there's a hidden agenda and they don't really say what they mean, but they say what they don't mean, but the audience gets it. And it becomes very confusing to me. I don't know how to learn. I don't know how helpful it is to talk about subtext as, oh, they're not really talking about what they really talk about, or the McKee example of instead of two lovers, a table with candlelight proclaiming their love to each other, which would be too on the nose. It's better if the two lovers are busy working to replace a flat tire, talking about that, but we get that they love each other. The problem with that analogy for me is that I think many times in human lives, people have been in romantic settings and have expressed their love to each other, and it's human life. What I suggest people do is set aside that notion of what a subtext is and think about subtext as an underlying action. This is how actors actually approach material. They don't want you to tell them what they're feeling in the scene or how to play this scene. They want to know, what am I doing in the scene? Dialogue that really moves is dialogue that's simply action by verbal means. They're doing something with the words. A useful rule of thumb is after you finish writing a scene, you look at it and you say, can I reduce each line of dialogue to a verb? Attack, defend, persuade, seduce, deflect, those kinds of verbs. The one you want to avoid is explain. There's no possibility really of conflict in that. And people do respond to tension and conflict, audiences. You try to avoid that. What I do get from a lot of students, certainly at the beginning, is what I call question and answer dialogue, or Q&A dialogue. And that would be, how are you today? I didn't sleep much last night. What about you? Oh, I'm feeling like I might go to the store today. What about you? I think I probably will go to McDonald's. Something, that kind of dialogue. It doesn't help a writer to have that in there. The counterexample I would give is, instead of how are you today, someone say I didn't sleep much last night, you would say, you look like hell. And then the other person replies, well, I didn't sleep much last night. Now instantly you've got attack, defend. And the reason they're telling them they didn't sleep much is because that's why I don't normally look like this. Instantly you have some kind of interaction. The actors can play it, and the reader and the audience can hook themselves in and follow that action. People follow action. They follow somebody doing something or something doing something. That's our natural way of approaching things. And if you can tap into that, then that helps your dialogue. Now, the other question that I haven't mentioned about on the nose, subtext doesn't deal with on the nose. If you understand subtext as a verb, that's just about making the dialogue dynamic. If you understand that on the nose is really, yes, it's saying things that the characters on their mind exactly, too obviously. The way to deal with that is through something that I and others would call indirection, or indirect speech, or I've heard it as conflicted speech. That's where you have these time-honored devices or tools called irony, metonymy, metaphor, wit. And an example of that use of irony is the easiest. If you have a scene that's too on the nose, quote unquote, simply try having the characters say the opposite of what they mean. That will give it an ironic twist. And you'll find that people often in life do use irony, especially if they have a relationship. They have shortcuts the way they talk, and they have ways they understand each other. If you have a character who has a new pair of shoes and they show it off and the other character doesn't like them, the other character could say, well, I don't like those shoes. Or they could say, nice shoes you got there.
Can I give you an example? There's something that I wrote, and it was a scene. There was a lady, and she was in heels. She was riding a motorbike, and she had a young child kind of tied around her waist behind her. So she was basically a very attractive mom. And she was described as a very attractive mom. The male character was on another motorbike, foreign character. He yelled out to her and said, you are not a hot mom. To me, I thought, well, that makes perfect sense. There's a little bit of irony there. Clearly she's hot. But I had several female readers read this, and they're like, this is not funny. What do you mean here? Why are you calling her not hot? That's mean. I'm like, no.
Yeah. Well, let's see. What's the context for the dialogue?
It was random. They were random. They were on motorbikes in a big, busy street and that kind of thing. So it was just completely random. And I actually had it written that the lady was smiling, so she knew he was joking too. At least the character knew that she was joking. But it was just so interesting. I had feedback from some people like, why are you being so mean to that lady? I'm like, oh my gosh, no one's being mean to her. This is the hard part that I think about writing sometimes, is that when you write it, you have to be careful because you've only got limited space. You only got 120 pages and so many words. How does one make sure, and this is the learned skill that you know all about, how does one make sure that if you're going to go this subtext direction, if you're going to go this irony direction, that the reader doesn't misinterpret it? Yeah,
well, that's certainly a risk. And I tell you, there was one project I was working on. There's an alpha couple that are like a team. They're kind of like spies. They're husband and wife. The wife is in the middle of some spy type. It was a light comedy, spy type situation. And the husband comes in late. He was supposed to be there earlier. She says, I'm glad you finally decided to show up. To me, it was pretty obvious what she really meant was, what are you doing? You almost got me killed. I was working with some people for whom English was a second language. They interpreted it as, I'm really glad to see you. They did not get the irony. They wind up changing the dialogue to that, and the scene falls completely flat. Yeah, you take a risk. You just have to do the best you can. Irony is the easiest, and I've heard it in life, seen it work easily in film, so it's worth a try, and it may not work. Another one is that I've seen done well is metaphor, where people, they can't talk about exactly what they mean for various reasons. By the way, there's an evolutionary reason why. What was it? In The Social Conquest of Earth by Edward O. Wilson, he talks about the role of indirect speech in evolution and why we have this. He said it's about plausible deniability. If you say to somebody, nice shoes you got there, and they're like, what are you talking about? You say, no, I'm just telling you got nice shoes. You can deny it.
And that's funny. Everyone likes that. You relate to that.
Yeah. And metaphor is the same thing. You have the scene I like to cite in the Billy Wilder film, Double Indemnity, where a man is trying to hit on a married woman in her home. He makes a pass at her and she switches to metaphor. She says there's a speed limit in this state, 45 miles an hour. And he slips right into it too. He says, how fast was I going, officer? And about 90. He says, well, why don't you get off your motorcycle and give me a ticket? He's flirting with her and pursuing her, but they're talking about traffic. It allows him to say, I wasn't hitting on your wife. We were talking about speed limits. That's all. So it's a way of saying something without saying something. That is a technique for avoiding on-the-nose dialogue. If the dialogue seems like it's coming off a little too obvious, then you can play with that. But I would recommend it be used like a spice. I would say subtext, where you're talking about verbal subtext, what somebody's doing with the words. You want that in most of your lines of dialogue. Indirection will be in some, you can use it in some cases, not always. You got to kind of use a judgment call. Aaron Sorkin is somebody, and if you look at The Social Network, if you love that dialogue, just take a look at it and you'll see most of the lines that are memorable, he just flipped it into irony. It comes off maybe as sarcasm, that's a form of attack, or various kinds of irony. They have the line when the two brothers are complaining to the president of the university. One of them says, I'm sorry, sir, but that makes no sense whatsoever. The president of the university says, I'm devastated by that. And obviously he means I don't care, but it just plays back and forth so beautifully. Anybody can do that if you know what they're doing, what he's doing. He just happens to do it very skillfully.
One last question for this episode. Hopefully I can keep pulling you on every now and again. I love picking your mind. As you mentioned dialogue, and you talk about the dialogue should not explain. I can think of a film that came out in the last few years, The Big Short, about the financial crisis. What's so interesting about that film is that, yes, there's character, yes, there's plot, there's story, but so much of that film is documentary-like in a way. It's very much explaining, but they did it in such a way that they keep you engaged.
Well, they smuggle it in, and that's the key. People don't respond well. Our human mind doesn't respond well to information that comes without any real context. A great example is a recipe in a recipe book when you're cooking. I don't know of anybody who takes a look at a recipe once and then goes and does it. I'm constantly going back, okay, what was that? Was it a teaspoon, a tablespoon? Because it's just simply a list of things to do. But if you contextualize things through emotion, through conflict, you will appeal to another side of human beings, which is that we like to take clues and put them together. If you have two people arguing about something, we piece together what they're arguing about from bits and pieces of what they say. We're in a natural place there. We can learn about the details that way. And we have to be told. The first part of any movie or a series is where we do have to be given information enough that we can experience what's happening.
There's got to be a setup.
Yeah, well, one technique, and I'll go to Toy Story, and because I just did it with the students. In the opening, you have to convey the fact that these toys, they panic every year because there's Christmas and New Year's because they're afraid they're going to get replaced. Okay, you could put that out there on the title, but it's not going to necessarily stick to anybody's brain. But what they did was they teased you, they teased the audience for about 4 or 5 minutes before they gave you any hint of what the problem was, by simply having the main character say his opening line is, "Oh my God, the party's today?" And it's like, that's a garlic in the coffee. Why is somebody worried about a party? Well, we gradually learn that this is a big problem and we don't know why. And we're teased and teased. And in a way, how do you get people to eat your food? Well, you make them hungry. How do you get people to take in the information? You make them hungry for it. In this case, they masterfully manipulate you until you're finally waiting for the explanation because you've been prepared for it. Smuggling in the information is a great skill in exposition, is a great skill for the first part of a film. Yeah, in the book we gave examples about how you can use this curiosity to make us wonder what's going on and then smuggle the information in a little at a time, and especially doing it as we need it. We don't need to know everything all at once at the beginning. We can learn a little bit at a time as we go. It'll stick with us. That's the strategy you have to use, whether it's a movie like The Big Short or pretty much anyone. You do have to get people to understand your world, and that's a skill.
Paul, I've kept you for longer. I can find myself talking to you for over 60 minutes very fast, very easily. I appreciate you coming on again.
Okay, well, I thank you for the dialogue. It's very interesting. Like I say, you're really good at this, and it's a fun conversation.
I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.